morning and welcome to our 6th webinar in the collection management course and the manual implementation. We're so glad to have you. Before we get started, let us just introduce ourselves, though you might know us, but it's always better to introduce. So first up, we have Michelle Hamer, the NSCF lead, and then Chanel Ribeiro, the NSCF project manager, and Audrey Ndaba, the NSCF collection management coordinator. And then myself, I'm Fulpero Tambani, the Science Communication Officer. We're so glad to have you on this webinar. Before we get started, we also just need to go through the webinar guidelines of engagement. So we ask that you keep your contributions helpful and considerate of the host and other participants. And you can use the chat box to say hello and let us know which institution you're coming from. I see this has started already, so thank you for getting this going. Thank you for greeting. It's our African tradition to greet whenever we get into a space. So let's get on to that. Swiso, thank you for getting us started. So good morning to everyone. I see Andre, I see Chantal, Cameron, I see Jermaine, Tikeledi, Apiwe. I can't go through all of you, but thank you and good morning. You can use the chat, the Q&A box, excuse me, to add your questions during the webinar. So as we are going through the webinar, whatever question comes to mind, just put that question in the Q&A box. This way we won't miss your questions, but if you put them in the chat box, we might miss them because there's other communication in the chat box. So please use the Q&A for questions. If we don't get to your question, please be patient with us. You can go to the webinar link, which will be on YouTube, as well as on Facebook, as we are streaming to Facebook. So you can just go and find the live stream on our Facebook page or the recording on the YouTube channel after it's loaded there. You can also visit our website, nscf.org.za, and you go to the resources tab, and you can open the collections management page. That's where you'll find all information relating to the course, as well as manual implementation and collection management. Now that we've gotten through the introduction and the guidelines, we can get started. So I'll hand over to Michelle to get us started. Michelle?
Thank you very much, Fulu, and good morning and welcome everybody to this webinar. So today the topic is health and safety in natural science collections. And what we're going to be talking about is what the difference is between health and safety. It's two different things. And we're going to talk about what are the main health and safety hazards in the collections, what can you do about them, so risk mitigation, including what the Occupational Health and Safety Act says, and then what are some of the steps you can take to mitigate some of the main hazards. And we'll look at roles and responsibilities. So what's the role of the responsibility of the institution, of the employees, the health and safety officers, health and safety committee, and the Department of Labour. So it's a very big topic and a lot to fit into 1 hour-long webinar. But let's get started. So the previous topic that we covered was risk and disaster management in the collections. And we were very much focused on the collections themselves. So the risks to the collections and disasters that could impact the collections. And so we were looking at collections. Some of those disasters or some of those risks also can impact on staff and other users of the collections, but some are not relevant. So insect pests that eat your collection are not a big health and safety risk to people. But there are some in common, and then there's some hazards or risks that affect people, but not the collection. So we've kept it separate just for that reason. So also, I think a lot of people will think, oh, I work in the collection, health and safety is not my job. That's what HR does, or we've got a special unit that does health and safety. We don't do health and safety. But the risks with the collections may not always be understood if you've got specific health and safety people. They might not understand what are the risks that are particular to the collections, and they might not take them into account in their plans or their activities. And then a second reason why we have to deal with health and safety is that all staff working in collections need to understand the hazards. So it's all of our responsibility, and they have to take the necessary precautions. So it's not something that you can push off to somebody else. Every single person needs to be involved in health and safety. So why is it so important? Well, the first thing is legal compliance. So there is this law, the Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And there's also there's a number of regulations that are legal requirements for institutions. So if you don't comply with what the Act says, then the institution can be shut down by the Department of Labour. Or if there is an injury or a fatality even, then what might happen is the chief executive officer, if they found to have not implemented or not complied with the Act, they can be held liable. They will have to go to court. So there's the legal side of things, but then there's also the ethics and human rights side of things. It's only ethical to make sure that staff and visitors to the collections are protected from injury and ill health. It's a human rights issue that you should have some level of safety and a healthy working environment. So we've been talking about health, safety. They are quite different, not always easy to distinguish. But when we talk about health, we're talking about a good state of health. That means that you're free from illness or pain or injury. And hazards usually affect a person's health. When they do, they can often take a long time to result in illness. So it's not an immediate thing. You get sick, and that sickness might not be on the day you're exposed to that hazard. It can be down the line. And so it's not always easy to define what are health hazards. And it's also not always easy to link cause and an effect. Did you get sick because of that? You can't always make that link very clearly. So the health risks or health hazards are quite difficult to work with. Safety, when we talk about safety, we're talking about a state of being safe where it's a condition where you're protected against physical, social, emotional consequences of some kind of failure, undesirable events. So safety hazards can make the surrounding conditions unsafe or risky, and they usually bring about an immediate effect. So it's usually an accident. You fall off a ladder. It happens immediately. And safety hazards are usually much easier to identify than the health hazards. And you can give very clear guidelines to manage safety hazards. All right, so that's just some background to what we're going to be covering today and just clarifying some points. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Audrey to take over.
So what are the main safety risks in collection? Fire has always come up as one of the risks. So someone was talking to me and asking me if their building has fire as a risk. And I said, as long as there are people in the building and you have electricity, you are sure guaranteed to have fire as a risk. And so some of the other examples that can cause fire are having flammable liquids and the flammable chemicals or other material that can, of course, cause fire. and the evaporation of the chemicals that we may have in the building. So yeah, those are examples of the risk of fire. And other causes of fires in the building are electrical faults. And some examples of the main safety risks in the collections are when you are working with the glass collection and you break bottles or containers where your collection is in, and you can sometimes slip and fall because of wet floor or because of an uneven surface. Or you can also just fall from a ladder while you are trying to access a shelving that is at a higher distance than you can reach. Another example is an injury from a collapsing structure or a heavy collection object falling on top of you. Another example is armed robberies or violent crime in your workplace or during a field trip when you are out. So what are the main health risks in the collection? So first, the health risks are those risks that can make you ill. So exposure to toxins that are used for pest control is an example of a health risk in a collection, and exposure of toxic preservatives that can accumulate in the air, those are examples of health risks. And working in storage or preparation areas where there are large amounts of dust or mold that could also cause you to fall ill. And exposure to diseases of animals. So when we collect or prepare collections, we can be exposed to disease from animals, from their tissues. So for this slide, I'm going to please ask that we post in the chat box what are some of the toxins that the specimens we have been exposed to. So if we can all post in the chat box the examples of the toxins that our specimens have been exposed to that may affect the staff or other users of the collection, so that we can just see the range of what comes out from our collections. So DDT, ethanol, naphthalene, yeah. So maybe we can continue posting them as we go, and formalin, yeah, the carcinogenic and the evaporation. If we can continue on the next slide, but you can keep posting them in the chat box. So the chemicals that are associated with the collections as you are posting them in the ethanol, the propanol, and yeah, all of those chemicals are the ones that could cause risk, example of a health risk in our lives. So people working in the collections are often exposed to the chemicals through inhalation, which is when we breathe the chemicals in. Sometimes it's through ingestion, where we drink or eat the chemicals, and sometimes you can just lick your hands and you've been touching a surface or the actual specimens with traces of whatever chemical is there. And so the inhalation is usually the most route of entry into the body, but some of them can be absorbed through skin, and the impact of the chemicals that we can find in our collection, they can cause cancer. Some of them are carcinogenics, and they can burn our eyes and skin, and they can cause the nervous system damage or damage even our internal organs. And so this is one of the big threats, I think, that we have in our collections. So health and safety hazards in the fieldwork. I think when we think of the fieldwork, it is often overlooked that there could be risk associated with the fieldwork. Sometimes because we drive in our cars every day back and forth, we think, I'm going to a field trip, and we may overlook them. So some of those risks is the car that you are traveling in could get in an accident, or you could have the car just failing on you, and there's no way to know that, okay, this car is going to break down. And you can also get a puncture, and if you never changed the tire before, then you would be struck. And you can sometimes lose keys, sometimes you lose them in the field while you are walking around collecting, and they fall off your pocket without you even noticing. So these are also just hazards or risks that we can experience during a field work. Others are weather related, where you can get lost in the mist, or you can have floods on the road or rivers preventing you getting to where you are trying to go. And for those people who are working in an aquatic environment, they can experience drowning. Either you are swimming, wading, snorkeling, scuba diving. Drowning is a real possibility that you have to think about. So if you cannot swim, do not try to say you will figure things out and pretend that you can swim. So institutions, I think, can even consider training staff to swim, because if your work requires you to go there, you should not be let out there without the knowledge of how to swim. And while there, you can also be bitten by snakes. I had a close encounter, but because I wasn't paying attention to the snake, I think that's why I got away with it. The snake did not see me as a threat. And you can be stung by various types of insects while you are out there. You can be attacked by large game. You could be sampling where you have your rhinos, your elephants, or even in water, the sharks. And so you always have those risks lingering if you are in the field. And you could also just fall asleep while you are trying to hike, or even in the forest or in the grass collecting. And who knows what you fall and hit. And so that's why it's not encouraged that we go to fieldwork alone. And yeah, exposure as well from the animals that we are trying to collect is very real. And I mentioned earlier that while we prepare them, we can easily just get the disease from the animal tissue. And health-related risks associated with food trips are also just the food poisoning. Because of the conditions in a field trip, you don't always have the luxury to cook, and sometimes you just have to go there with prepared meals that you just warm up and eat on the go. And also you could be exposed to sun and experience heat stroke, because you could be walking during the day and it's so hot. Or the most common one is the dehydration. And if it's cold, especially if you are working inside the water and you are exposed to too much cold, you could also just suffer from cold exposure. And so there's lots and lots more. I'm sure you can think of many risks that you only maybe realized when you were out in the field that, oopsie, you didn't come prepared for this. With that, we are going to have a poll on the health and safety hazards that you may have experienced at work. People were sharing examples of risk that they have experienced, and they vary from having your food taken away by baboons, and you can't do fieldwork if you are hungry, especially if you have a long way to walk or hike, and avoiding angry cows. And I have actually come across angry people who chased us and said we should not be here if we are not bringing them improvement in their village. And I was actually shocked to experience that. And so, yeah. Thank you so much. I am going to hand over to Chanel.
Thank you, Audrey. Okay, so after hearing about all the things that can go wrong, let's have a look at what we can do to prevent risks or reduce their effects. So it's not possible to remove all risks. If you do collections work, you will be exposed to health and safety risks. However, the law prescribes what every institution must do to mitigate or manage those risks. So what an institution should put in place. And then employers also have a responsibility. It's not just your organization. So employees, you have a responsibility for your own health and safety, and also others that work with you. Let's have a look at what is required by the Act. So firstly, the Act says that institutions must have a health and safety policy, and it must be displayed in a readily accessible area. It can't just be an email, and this must be reviewed and updated regularly. Institutions must also conduct assessments of the risks in order to identify those specific to their environment. This means that it can't be a generic document. It must be specific to your environment and situation. And then they must decide what precautions are needed to mitigate and manage those risks. And this must be updated. So assessments are required on a regular basis to monitor control measures and any changes in the status of the risks. For example, new equipment and processes will need to be considered, accident records need to be reviewed, and the suitability of previously selected PPEs should sometimes be reevaluated. Monitoring and surveillance of risks and impacts on health must be carried out, especially for work involving hazardous substances. And then the Act says institutions are required to take all reasonable actions required to prevent accidents and risks from happening. So reasonable actions give space for budget and capacity constraints, but this doesn't mean they should do nothing because of the constraints. The plan should work within the constraints. Then moving on to training and communication that the Act requires. So it says that staff must be informed and updated on a regular basis of the risks, the monitoring and mitigation actions, and outcomes of all incidents that have occurred. And we know this often doesn't happen, but staff must be given this information at least on a quarterly basis. Staff must also be appropriately trained to work with the hazardous materials and to deal with the risks identified. And then also visitors, students, volunteers, any contractors working in the collection must be briefed on the relevant risks and also what has been put in place to mitigate this. Importantly, institutions must mark potentially dangerous chemicals and display appropriate signage in this regard. For example, every bottle with liquid must be properly labeled and state if it is poisonous or hazardous. And also the area where chemicals are kept should be clearly marked. Okay, so after looking at what the organization's responsibilities are, let's have a look at what is expected from employees. So you yourself must take responsibility in understanding the risks and mitigation measures relevant to your work, for your own health and safety, and also for those whose health and safety may be compromised by your actions. You must comply with any instructions related to health and safety, so wearing the PPEs that were issued to you, and reporting on any situation which you consider to be unhealthy or unsafe, or in any incident that has occurred must also be reported. So it is your duty to report those incidents. If something happens like a chemical spill, you shouldn't try and hide it. Then let's have a look at some specific mitigation actions for fire. So firstly, the right equipment must be available. So fire detection systems, suppression systems, systems to monitor vapors of ethanol or other flammable substances. And importantly, suppression systems should not harm people and should be correct type for the type of collection, so wet or dry collections. And then firefighting equipment, it should also be the appropriate type and it should be in the correct location for extinguishers and hoses and so forth. And then there are also things that can be done to protect the staff. So fire doors can be installed, and important to locate offices away from high-risk storage areas. So it's not acceptable to have staff sitting in the same place where large amounts of ethanol is kept. Then procedures that should be followed. and considered is you should have an emergency response plan so that everyone knows what to do in an emergency. There should be inspections by fire experts or the fire department, and they can help you to identify risks, recommend mitigation measures, and also check your evacuation plans. And fire detection and suppression systems should be checked and maintained regularly, and it should be documented when that maintenance is done. Exit routes must be kept clear of clutter and obstacles. So fire escapes and exit routes are often blocked by things that have accumulated over the years, like boxes and furniture, and that this blocks corridors and stairwells. And then the firefighting team should also be trained, and their training should be up to date, and fire drills should be carried out regularly. So it's important to learn from those fire drills. So when you do the drills, check what went wrong, what can be fixed, what can be changed. So when there's a real situation, something doesn't block you. For toxins, it's important for institutions to know which chemicals are in your building, including residues on collection objects, and which of these are considered to be hazardous. And very importantly, you have to have an inventory of all stored hazardous substances, including the location. For example, if we look at the recent UCT fire, the fire department didn't want to go into the building until they knew what hazardous substances were kept there and where they were kept. So it's very important to have an inventory. And then I saw someone else that posted this in the chat, I think it was Darby. So you have to have material safety data sheets for all chemicals as well on file. And the institution needs to know whether staff are being exposed or are absorbing hazardous chemicals, and at what levels and through what route. And this can be done by air monitoring, expert analysis of services and objects. And also know whether the health of staff is being affected by exposure to these chemicals by sending your staff for regular medical surveillance. And put in place all reasonable measures to remove or reduce the exposure of staff to these chemicals. Also important is the assessments of potential exposure to hazardous chemicals must be done at least every 2 years, the Act says. So the assessments of the air monitoring and the medical surveillance. And it says that the employer shall keep records of the results of all assessments for at least 30 years. And medical surveillance reports and so forth must be able to be provided, but personal medical records shall only be made available to an occupational health practitioner. So that is private and that won't be shared with everyone. So because we can't avoid having contact with chemicals, we can limit the exposure to the chemicals. For example, when you are topping up ethanol, limit the amount of time to 30 minutes in that room, then take a break and then go back later. Or another measure is to limit the number of staff that does have exposure. Importantly, staff must also be aware of the chemicals and potential impacts on how to avoid exposure. And there must be the, sorry, I just lost my place here. Oh yes, okay, so the use of PPEs. So use those PPEs that are issued to you. It's not an option if you feel like it or not. And regulations for the specification for storage, ventilation, and working with the chemicals are also covered in the regulations. So you can go have a look at that. So then we also have hazardous biological materials. So the more people live close to animals, the more the risk of zoonosis increases. And staff need to be aware of these risks, not only to themselves, but also to others in their workplace, or even those outside the institution who may be exposed while transporting or disposing of materials. And so the regulations would apply to any staff member who works with animals, and this includes blood or other tissues where these may be potentially harbor microorganisms that could be transmitted to humans. And the regulations require that the risks be identified and precautions must be taken to protect employees. And these precautions include a few things. So firstly, it's protective clothing and respiratory protective equipment, safe working procedures regarding the use, handling, storage, labeling, disposal of the materials in the workplace, the procedures to be followed in the event of exposure, or in the event of a spillage, or a leakage, or an injury, or any other similar emergency situation. And also the procedures that need to be followed for the decontamination or disinfection of contaminated areas. And then also importantly, the Section 20 of the Animal Diseases Act is also relevant here. We also have to consider physical injuries to staff working in the collections. So if you're working in an elevated position, don't do like the guy there in the picture, who's in a very precarious position there. So you have to use a ladder or scaffolding, and it must be sufficiently sturdy. And you must also take care to prevent items falling on staff or visitors. And staff must ensure that all shelving is sturdy and securely fixed. So collection objects must not be stacked or stored in such a way that they could fall or injure someone. And if crates and containers are piled on top of each other, there is a high risk of staff trying to access the lower containers, and then they can injure their backs or drop heavy containers on them. Let's have a look at risk mitigation during field work. So all relevant risks identified for the specific type of field work must be carried out, and a detailed response and mitigation plan must be developed. So think through every possible risk and what should be done if it happens. And include the following measures. So the contact details for all emergency services and institutional managers must be available in a specific location in each vehicle, and it must be regularly updated. So the cell phone number of the expedition leader must be there in the vehicle, and this has to be printed out and not stored somewhere in an email on your phone. I mean, maybe you won't be able to access it when you don't have any coverage there. So importantly that it is printed out and everyone knows where in the vehicle it's stored. Then there should also be one fully trained first aider available on each field trip, and a fully equipped first aid kit must be available. And there should be clear guidelines included in the kit regarding any medicines that are in it, and also a first aid booklet. And then vehicles must be checked before departing on a field trip to ensure that they are mechanically sound and that there's a spare tire and any necessary tools that you might require, like wheel spanners or jacks and so forth. And all participants in the field trip must be briefed on health and safety risks and mitigation measures before the field trip starts. Okay, so that's a lot to think about and consider. So let's hear from you again what you have experienced while doing fieldwork. So we have had quite a few little anecdotes in the chat, but let's do the poll and see what dangers you've been exposed to. So sure, you guys have really been roughing it out there. I see 2 people said they were chased by a rhino or an elephant or a buffalo. And then, yeah, most people said they were stung or bitten by poisonous animals, so 47%. And most people had a vehicle breakdown, 44%, and so forth. So, yeah, a lot of things happening to people, and I'm sure in many of the instances, the mitigation measures weren't thought of. So like the missing tools in the vehicle and not being able to prepare it. So yeah, you can see there's so many scenarios that you have to think of all the time before going on a field trip. Okay. Thank you for that. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand over to Fulu now.
Thank you, Chanel. I was just surprised by Roger's input on the chat saying he has been arrested while he was in the field. That's scary. So you guys are going through a lot. So to continue, let's get on to the general health and safety measures that you need to have in place. So the first one is just good housekeeping. You need to keep your workspaces clear of clutter, of materials, of tools that you're not using. So keep it clean and organized, not the picture on the far left, on the top far left. That's not how your workspace is supposed to be. I know it can be difficult to do this, but when you do it, it's gonna mitigate some of those dangers. And then all floors, walkways, all stairs, passages, gangways, all these must be in a good state of repair. So if anything is chipped or if anything is broken, you need to make sure that you fix those, you repair them. They must be skid-free and free of obstructions, waste, or materials. So try to avoid putting material, boxes, furniture, anything on the walkways. So anywhere where people have access, please try to avoid putting material there. So basically these two, the top and bottom picture, that's not how it's supposed to be. The middle one is how your workspace or your office or your building is supposed to be, or at least try to have it look like that. So in terms of the first aid and emergency preparedness, accidents will happen. We can't avoid that. But it's important to have emergency preparedness procedures. So you need to know when the accident happens, what are you going to do? And always be prepared with this. So you need to have telephone numbers for local first aiders and emergency services. And it should be very easy for people to find this. It should be in a place that's very easy to see, very easily available, very easy to access. So, and in all relevant places. Doesn't matter how many you need to put up, as long as it's there and easy to access for everyone in the institution. Institutions need to provide first aid kits for each of their sections. Doesn't matter how many you have, each section needs to have a first aid kit. And they must be kept at a central location, going back to it being easily accessible. And there must be a sign, a clear sign that indicates what it is. It's a first aid kit, and where the contact details of the person responsible for the first aid kit is. This needs to be very clear. And also, if I can add, it must be in the clearest language. It must be in the simplest language, so that whether you are educated or not, you know what that is. And These first aid kits must have the required items for the particular type of hazards at the institution. And they must not hold items that are not approved or required for an institutional first aid kit. So what's required needs to be there. What's not required should not be there. Collection workrooms should have their own emergency stations, including such facilities as those for emergency washing of eyes. And staff and visitors, so whoever has access to that collection or that area, they are at risk of accidents involving chemicals, and they need to know or be trained on how to use the washing of eyes, the emergency washing of eyes station. So they need to know what to do when they get there. If it happens to them, what to do when they get to that station. It's no use people knowing that there is a place where I wash my eyes, but not know how to use it. So they need to be trained. Institutions must have at least one fully trained first aider for every 50 staff on duty. So if you have people work, 100 people working at the same time, there has to be 2 fully trained first aiders in that instance. But if it's 50, it can be 1. But it's also always better to have more than 1 if you can. In institutions where there are toxins or hazardous chemicals, the first aiders must be trained in dealing with accidents related to these hazards. So they need to know what to do. It's very important to know what to do and not just have that title of being a first aider and not know what to do. Especially when dealing with emergencies, you can get very easily confused, but if you know how to do it and what to do, it's better, you will deal with the emergency better. And then health and safety officers, you need to have this. You need to have health and safety officers in your institutions, and there must be 1 health and safety officer for every 20 employees. And then they must be appointed in writing and for a specified period of time. So it needs to be clear. I guess it's like an appointment letter. You need to know that I have this title from January to June, or from 2021 to 2023, whatever the case may be. And the role includes identification of health and safety risks and hazards, and assessment and inspection of any mitigation measures implemented, and investigating and health and safety risks and complaints raised by staff. Make representation to the employer on any health and safety matter. So this person has to be knowledgeable in all of this. So anything that has to do with health and safety, the person has to be knowledgeable. And this person has to also be a member of the Health and Safety Committee. And then you must also have the Health and Safety Committee, which the Health and Safety Officer has to be a member of, as we said in the previous slide. And the Health and Safety Committee must be established and must meet at least every 3 months. So you need to meet every 3 months as this committee. And the meeting must be documented. So there has to be minutes recording what was discussed. The role of this committee is to make recommendations to the employer or where the recommendations fail to resolve the matter to an inspector regarding any matter affecting health and safety of persons at the workplace. And another role is to discuss any incident at the workplace. So like it was said, any incident that happens in terms of health and safety for employees, it has to be reported. So the committee will discuss those incidents in which a person was injured, became ill, or died, and may also in writing a report on the incident to an inspector. So a report is, so you will, if you have an accident, you'll report it to the committee, and the committee will write a report about that incident, which will then go to an inspector. And another role is to keep record of each recommendation. So whatever recommendation is made, it has to be recorded, and it has to be made to an employer, and of any report made to an inspector. So there has to be a record of everything that happens in terms of health and safety in the institution, whether it was an incident, whether that incident was reported to an employer, whether that report was sent to an inspector, all has to be recorded. So after all that, we will do a poll now. We want to know if you have any of these in your workplace. Do you have health and safety officers? Do you have a health and safety committee? Do you have a first aid kit? Do you have trained first aiders? Do you have an eye wash station? And do you have an emergency response plan for injuries or illness? We'll give you some time to answer these questions. So 84% of people have health and safety officers, and 90% have a first aid kit. 72% have a health and safety committee. That's good. 72% has trained first aiders. That's great. Only 26% has an eye wash station. All right. And 30% says they have an emergency response plan for injuries or illness. That's not great. It's very important. I'm sure after this you will get one. Thank you so much for that. All right, so the documents that must be kept and available for inspection, because you will have inspections. All qualifying incidents must be reported to the Department of Labour as required by the Act. All incidents must be investigated and reviewed, and measures put in place to avoid the same type of incident reoccurring. So if you haven't had a certain incident and now it happens, you must take that as an opportunity for you to develop measures to avoid that in future. You might find that now you maybe can't think of it, but once it happens, it's an opportunity to develop something to mitigate it. All health and safety related assessments, plans, training, and incidents must be documented and kept on file, with monitoring records and medical surveillance records being retained for at least 30 years, just like it was shared before. The OHS Act is enforced by the Department of Labour, whose inspectors may do the following. So they can enter any workplace without prior notice. They can just rock up at your institution and want to inspect your health and safety standards or situation. They can request any document. So you need to have all documents up to date and even developed if you don't have. They can inspect any condition, process, plant, or article. They can also take samples or seize any article, right? And they can question or summon any person within the workplace. So when I go through this is quite threatening. So it's better to have your things in place, your documents in place, and your health and safety standards and procedures up to date to avoid such situations. It's not a comfortable situation. So if you have any questions, remember to put them on the Q&A box. We have one question from Ian. He says, shouldn't it be 2 trained first aiders on field trips? What if the first aider is the one who is injured or unconscious? Michelle, do you want to answer that? But I think it's a good point.
Yes, okay, so obviously, ideally, it would be better to have more than one, but it should be at least one. So yes, of course, if that person is the one who's injured, then you could be in trouble if they're unconscious. But at least if they were just injured, they would be able to guide the others. But actually, everybody who goes into the field should be trained in first aid, basic first aid. And Ian shared a really nice advert yesterday. We must share it with everybody for first aid for people working in the field. So it's for field guides and game rangers and that kind of people. So yeah, if you can do that kind of course, I think it would be very valuable. But at least one person, at least, should have first aid training. And remember that first aid training, you have to repeat it every so often. I can't remember exactly how often it is, but maybe somebody else knows how often, how long is your training valid for. You have to repeat it. So Roger says that everybody should have first aid training, everybody who goes into the field. I agree. So next week, next Wednesday, we've got the discussion forum on this topic. And what we really need is volunteers to tell us about health and safety experience. There were some really interesting stories or points coming up at the beginning of the webinar. And it's from each other that we learn the most, because people who've been in real situations or done or really experienced things can share much better than just in theory. So if you deal with hazardous chemical materials in your collections, if you have monitoring systems for monitoring the levels in the environment, if you have ventilation systems, you can share with us how you deal with chemicals, hazardous chemicals or toxins in your work environment. And it can be a short presentation. You can tell us about your fire detection and suppression systems, your evacuation routes or your fire drills and how often you have them and how they work. If you do field work in water, you can tell us, do a short presentation on all the precautions you have to take. I know that the people are usually very strict about this. If you've got field work guidelines for health and safety, you can tell us about those. If you work with hazardous biological materials, so if you're handling especially things like rats and bats, maybe birds, that are likely to spread disease, how do you do that? How do you handle them? Precautions you take, your procedures you follow, how do you dispose of the waste? And then if any of you have done a health and safety inspection, how did you do it? What did you look for? Did you have a checklist? What do you do? Have any of you been involved in medical surveillance? So we have seen on the WhatsApp group some brave people who were sent to go and have their medical examination. Tell us about it. You don't have to tell us about the outcome, but we'd love to hear how you were selected, why you were selected, and what did they do to you when you went there? So we can see. So it would be really wonderful to hear this. These can be short presentations. We want to have probably about 10 presentations next week. They can be between 5 and 10 minutes to share your experience and your knowledge and your practices and even some of the challenges that you might be facing. So let's use this forum to learn from each other, and then we'll have an open discussion and on some of the points from people. So we're really asking, you can send me an email, send Fulu and I an email and just say, I want to talk about this. And then we'll have a practice session next Tuesday, and then we'll have the discussion forum on Wednesday. That would be really good. And we hope that you'll all join us for this very, very important topic. All right, so that's the end of the webinar.